on QA/QC procedures. I think I've met pretty much everybody who's on the call, but if not, my name's Brett Cohen, and I'm going to be leading today's session in conjunction with Luann Stevens. So the two of us will be running it jointly. So I'm just going to share my screen just to sort of introduce the preliminaries before I hand over to Luann to then get going on the content today. So hopefully you are able to see my screen. I think we're all pretty slick on Teams at the moment, so I'm sure you can, but if not, let me know if there are any problems. So yeah, as we mentioned, this is a QA/QC training session run under an ICAT project, a transparency project being funded by the Initiative for Climate Action Transparency, and the work's being done by Gondwana Environmental Solutions, in association with DFFE. Martin, I'll hand over to you initially just to give a bit of an introduction to Gondwana, and then we'll give you a little bit more about Luann and myself.
Thanks, Brett. Welcome everybody to today's training session. As Brett said, most of us have been on these calls already. This is now the fourth session already that we're undertaking. And yeah, as Brett said, we're the appointed service provider to undertake this ICAT project to capacitate provinces around climate change actions and tracking thereof. And we have with us two very competent trainers, Brett and Luann, who are experts in the field, and we look forward to their input. So thanks, Brett, and back to you.
Thanks very much, Martin. Luann, I don't know if it's necessary for you to introduce yourself, but you're very welcome to, given that most people know who you are by now.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Yes, I do think that we know everybody on the line, as you say, but maybe if there's one or two new people. My name is Luann Stevens, and I do a lot of work on the national greenhouse gas inventory, so that's at the national level, and I've been doing training, capacity building around greenhouse gas inventories for well over 10 years. So, and I have particular interest in agriculture and land. But yes, we have been doing, as I say, conducting various training sessions during this ICAT project, and so we look forward to providing you with some information on QA/QC processes this morning. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Luann. And again, I'm Brett Cohen. I'm also been working on inventory-related work for a number of years on the sectors that Luann doesn't cover. So I have an interest in energy systems and energy inventories, as well as IPPU and the waste sector as well. So I think we bring a fair coverage of the national and obviously provincial inventories to the training. So just the purposes of today's training is, first of all, to understand what QA/QC is, and more importantly, why it is important. We then want to understand what a QA/QC plan includes. Sorry, I don't know why those four people are sitting there. We will then provide a lot more information or in-depth information on examples of QC procedures largely. And of course, as you've experienced in our previous trainings, we're very keen on this idea of peer learning. So very much encourage you through the training to put up your hand or just jump in whenever something resonates with you or where you've got additional questions to ask. And of course, as importantly, is to share what your experiences have been around this topic of QA/QC. So again, last week, Luann and I were very, very happy with the way the session ran as an interactive session, and pleased to encourage you to do the same on today's session. So those are the four outcomes from today. And on that note, I'll hand over to Luann to give the first part of the training material.
Great. Thanks, Brett. Let me just try and share my screen. Right. Yeah, so as Brett has mentioned, I will be providing just the sort of general overview of QA/QC processes for greenhouse gas inventories. Before I forget, I did just put a registration form in the link in the chat. So if you could just click on the link and register, I would appreciate that. We will post the link. Maybe I'll just post it again in case there's been new people attending. Just write it here in case people have joined. Yeah, so if you can just fill in the registration link, I'd appreciate it. Right, so back to the presentation. So I'll just be giving a general overview of the process. And as Brett says, if there's anything you don't understand or you have queries about, please feel free to jump in at any point. We want this to be engaging and interactive and, not formal. So just stop me if you have any queries. Sorry, can you see my screen just by the way?
Yeah, we can. Thanks, Luann.
Okay, it's just I don't see it on my side. Anyway, okay. Right, so QA/QC procedures are so planning and implementing QA/QC procedures are a very important part of the development of a greenhouse gas inventory and at any level. So no matter whether you're doing your inventory at a provincial, national, local, it is important to have QA/QC procedures to ensure the integrity of your inventory. So it's really an integral part of the system. So really, what are we talking about when we talk about quality control? So quality control is a system of routine and planned technical activities implemented by the inventory development team to measure and control the quality of the inventory as it is being prepared. So the main thing here is that quality control checks are done by the team that is developing the inventory. Okay, so it's people that are involved in the inventory. So it's really to check, to do checks to ensure data integrity, correctness, completeness, to identify if there's any errors, looking at whether you're using the correct emission factors and methodologies, to check data acquisition and calculations, and just to generally check the methods and data that is as the inventory is being compiled. So that's the main thing about quality control. It is done during the development of the inventory by the people involved in the preparation of that inventory. Now, when we go to quality assurance, this is slightly different in that this is a planned system of reviews or audit procedures conducted by people not involved in the inventory. So this is like a second pair of fresh eyes, because often when people are involved in the inventory and they know the work very well, your eyes don't pick up on the errors because you've been looking at it for so long. And so it is sometimes good then to have external people have a look at it and see and to conduct a review or an audit of the process. So these are usually done by an independent third party, and they verify the data quality objectives defined by the inventory agency and ensure that the inventory possesses the best possible estimates of emissions and sinks and data available at the time. And it's just part of, it supports the quality control program. So I know that QA is done a lot at national level, so it's very important at a national level to do quality assurance. And so maybe we'll have a question session later where everyone can provide their thoughts from a provincial level as to whether quality assurance procedures get done. So, but yeah, it's really an external people that are not involved in the inventory. As part of the QA/QC planning, well, I mean, maybe we should just ask the question now, actually, while we're on here. Does anybody, so that we can have interaction, does anybody at the provincial level, do they do any form of sort of quality assurance on their inventories? Do you have an external person? Does anyone know? Yes,
Lisa.
Hi. So Western Cape, we don't have a formal QA process. We don't have an informal QA process either. But we do, as we share the data with others in the province, they might come up and pick up something that looks a bit strange to them, and so it's a very, very informal process. It's just a resources, time, capacity challenge is the reason why we don't do anything more formal. But so we've got quite a good relationship with our energy team, and some of them have previously been at UCT with the energy research team, so they've got a lot of experience in this, so they will be able to pick up if there's anything majorly problematic with this data. But yeah, it's very, very informal.
Luann, sorry, I don't know if you can see the hands, but Matthew's got his hand up as well.
Maybe if you can just point at the hand.
Sure.
And then,
No problem. Matthews, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. Similar as well. We have a number of informal arrangements, but we currently trying to formalize one. We currently speaking to CSIR and GCRO. So hopefully maybe by the end of the year we'll have something, but currently it's informal. There's nothing formal. Thanks.
Okay. Great. Well, I mean, at least it sounds like there is some checking, but yeah, I mean, the quality control is obviously more important at this stage, particularly with resources and everything. But maybe, as you say, quality assurance is something as they progress, provinces can think about incorporating into their plans as we go forward. Okay, thanks. That's good to know. I don't see any more hands, so I'll carry on. So I just wanted to look a bit at the QA/QC sort of planning process and the various different steps that are included here. So we really identify the QA/QC team and assign roles and responsibilities.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, sorry,
Luann Matthews has got his hand up again.
Yes, Matthews.
Yes, I just want to ask the question I asked on the last training. I think it's relevant now. On the QA, I think I understand the definitions between QC and QA, but on the project, we do have a project steering committee, which is mainly made up of people who are not from the department, and it's a mixture from outsiders and from the department, DFFE, other departments, and now GCRO is also part of the steering committee. Could that be considered quality assurance?
Yeah, I think they are external, and so if they're doing, if they're actually looking at the inventory numbers and providing all the reports and providing some feedback, then that would constitute a form of quality assurance because they're outside of the actual development process, so they're not involved in developing the actual inventory. So all those sort of so a steering committee, I guess, if they're, as I say, commenting on the inventory or the report, could be considered as a quality assurance step.
Noted, thanks.
Okay, so right, so the planning process. So okay, so you set up the teams obviously and assign roles and responsibilities and identify the objectives. And then setting up the timeframes for the QAC process is important. And then identifying the actual activities for QC and for QA, develop a plan, and then implement the plan, and then document and archive the QA/QC activities. So I'm just going to go through briefly these steps, what's involved in each step, and then, yeah. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, of course, I think we discussed this also with the institutional arrangements that at a provincial level, there's always very limited resources and people available, and it's usually you, me, and I doing all the work. But I think it's just good to put it in here that, different people can have multiple roles. So it's not like you have to have now another layer of completely different people to do the QC process. So, like the people that are compiling the energy inventory could do a QC on the agriculture, for example. So, different people can have multiple roles. But it is noted that everybody has very limited resources, but still good to identify those resources and indicate who is going to be responsible for what, so that the team knows upfront what the expectations are. And then, of course, if you have a QA process, you may need institutional arrangements for that. If it's an external reviewer that's going to come in, you may need, or another government agency, you may need some institutional arrangements to be set up for that QA process. So, here in this table is just some ideas of people that or activities that you may need for, and roles and responsibilities. So there would be obviously the lead agency or department who would be responsible for the general QA/QC procedures. And then a QAC coordinator could coordinate overall implementation of these activities and maintain the QA/QC plan. Again, you may have to have one person doing more than one role. Then you have the category leads, so implement source and category specific QAC activities. So these would be people that have an understanding of the specific categories. So they would conduct, that are compiling that inventory, could conduct a QC on that particular category. And then, as we've heard already, some people make use of outside experts. They could be from industries or universities or consultation groups, to give input. So these would be outside people. And then, depending on if you have consultants involved either in process for the QAC process, or if you have consultants doing a QA support activity. So these are just the types of roles and people that may be included within your inventory, your QA/QC team. So following on from this, you need to identify exactly what your objectives are. So you need to clearly outline what they are, and they're usually to improve, the aims of the QA/QC process is to improve the transparency, accuracy, consistency, and comparability and completeness, which are your TACCC principles, and improve, and this is also very important, to improve the confidence of your inventory, because you want the output, you want people to have confidence in your numbers and your outputs from your inventory. So having these QA processes, it gives stakeholders more confidence in the outputs that you are giving to them, and obviously to ensure that you meet the timelines that you've set out for completing your inventory. So just to look at the TACCC principles of transparency, accuracy, completeness, consistency, and comparability. So transparency, I think we all understand, this is really to ensure that everything is well documented and that the inventory is transparent, so that it's enough to show an external audience or an external reviewer how the inventory was done, and so they can see that good practices were followed in the development of the inventory. So transparency is all around documenting everything from the inventory compilation to even the QA process. Accuracy, obviously, you want the numbers to be as close to the correct values as possible, so neither over or underestimated. Completeness, to ensure that all relevant categories and gases are included as far as possible. Obviously, if you are aware that there are emissions from a particular category, but you have insufficient data, even if you indicate that it's not, you use your notation keys and indicated that it's not estimated, then the reviewers can see that you've considered that category, just not have insufficient data at this point, but it will be something perhaps that gets done in the future. So completeness is to consider all the possible emissions within your province. Consistency, in that methods are consistent between years if you have more than 1 year, gases, and between the categories, so that we can actually see real differences, and then there are not changes due to a change in emission factors or changes in methodologies over time. So it's important to be consistent. And then comparable. So in this case, it would be perhaps comparable to other province inventories. It allows you to make comparisons across and also perhaps even comparisons at a national level. But just because you're using consistent methodologies, it brings in that ability to have the comparability as well with other provinces and national level inventories. So these are the main principles, and these are really what the point of the QA/QC process is to assist with, to improve the transparency, accuracy, completeness by having someone review and indicate where these can be improved or updated before you finalize the inventory. So in terms of timeframes, it's obviously important to ensure that you set out a plan of when these activities will occur and what the timelines are. I think often, yes, I see a question. Yeah, Matthews?
Yes, can we discuss consistency for a minute? Is it
Yes,
possible
sure.
to be consistent with methodologies if the science itself has not matured? Or even if you can't be consistent, does it mean that you have to restate, you have to recalculate in a way to use the current methodology that you have acquired at the time? I don't know if the question is clear. For example, the national report now is going to use AR5. Then that means that it literally has to restate now, recalculate all the previous years, because now you can't compare like for like.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. You're quite correct. The new the national inventory will use AR5, and the previous one used the second assessment report. So well, with a national inventory, which may not necessarily be true for provincials, although it may come with time, the national inventory has a whole time series, and so it has to be consistent. The methodology has to be consistent over the entire time series as well. So if we make a change like to the AR5 in the new national inventory, then we have to apply that change to the entire time series. So consistency is often more related to if you have a sort of time series, and this may come if you have 2 years worth of inventories, so that it is comparable. And so, yeah, so with the national inventory, whenever changes are made, it has to be done for all the years going back as well. And so if you change methodologies, so if you change your methodologies and say you move to a tier 2 or you have a tier 1 and it's difficult to find the data, you have to indicate that the time series is consistent or that there is a break in the time series for whatever reason, so that it's then again transparent. So all these sort of aspects are kind of linked to each other. You need to be transparent so that people can see where the inconsistencies are, if there are any. But yeah, the methodology is trying to be, it's more consistent, I guess, through the years, but also with the gases and categories, so that actual changes can be determined. So, I mean, what you're talking about in terms of like the national, now we're changing to AR5. So when I talk to people, when you look at the newest, latest inventory, it's not really useful to compare to the previous inventory. It should have updated the full time series and will automatically in the latest report compare it to the previous inventory, but using those updated factors. So it's better to look at all the information in the latest national inventory report. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Yes,
Luann,
cover things.
can I add something to that? I think
Yeah.
what it highlights really is the importance of setting up your spreadsheets and your calculation sheets efficiently, so that if you want to go back and update, for example, a global warming potential, you can do it in one place on your spreadsheet, and then that'll carry forward to all the calculations, rather than having multiple places where various factors are shown. And I'm going to talk to that a little bit later on, but just to highlight, to think ahead to being able to make changes like this.
Yeah. Yeah, so as you say, I know you'll touch on that more later, but yeah, the structuring of your sort of inventory, or if you're using spreadsheets in particular, how you set it out can assist very much with the QA/QC process. You'll see Brett will touch on a couple of pointers that can be used if you're using spreadsheet based. If you're using a tool, then it often has inbuilt areas where you can add information and notes on all of this information. But yeah, wherever you can build it into the process, it's much easier rather than having it as an afterthought. And I also think that, you know, when we plan, which I didn't talk about in the planning, is that we plan to have sufficient time to do QA/QC processes, because often it's more rushing just to get the numbers, and there's no real time is planned for the QA/QC process. So yeah, but I'm sure also as we point out some things and you know, tools and spreadsheets for develop and evolve over time. So you can try to incorporate some of these aspects perhaps into your sheets as you go forward as well.
And sorry, I think this is
Yeah.
where series was actually good at, because series it's in one place, the AR report, so you can just actually with one tab change from AR2 to AR5. But I don't know with the other sheets how it works. But with the software, APCC software, it's the same as well. It's much easier.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's why series was actually good.
So I can tell you, I mean, as Brett will talk about, maybe we'll talk about it a bit later, but if you just have them up front, you know, in your spreadsheet, then if you just have one place that you need to, you just refer to that cell and you just have that one place that you need to change it, then it's also easier. But maybe I'll leave that and Brett can talk a little bit about that later on and give some examples. Yeah, but I think the point is thinking about these upfront does sometimes help to prepare. Okay, oh, right, so the time frame. So I think as I was mentioning, the time frames, it's good to ensure that you do consider the time to do the QA/QC processes from the beginning. So if you plan your inventory cycle, ensure that you also have a plan of your QA/QC process. And this is usually happening at the same time, or as you've developed the sectoral ones, you can do a QC on the sectoral, and then you can have the final combining all the sectors together, and then a QC on all of the sectors together, and write your report, and then have a QA process. So it fits in with your whole inventory preparation cycle. So just consider it up front and ensure that there's sufficient time to conduct some of these processes. Yes, and then it's to identify your actual activities that you're going to conduct as part of your quality checking process. And so there are a number of checks that you can do. There are what we'd call general checks and category specific checks. So the general checks are just sort of routine checks that are implemented across all phases of the inventory development. So this is not specific to a category. This could just be just checking that the units are correct. So these would be something that you would check throughout, checking that the numbers are being added up correctly, very basic routine checks that each of the sectors may have, or even the overall sectors, overall calculation files will have. So these routine checks, and they do not necessitate having specific knowledge of a source or a sink category. So because of this, you don't necessarily have to have a skilled person or somebody with specific knowledge of a source category to conduct these general checks. They can be someone that has a knowledge and understanding generally of the spreadsheets or of the tool that you're using, and they can just do some of these very basic checks across throughout the inventory. Whereas on the other hand, you have more category specific checks, and these are really on a sort of case-to-case basis. And I think Brett will also talk a little bit later on how you prioritize these. But basically, it's more related to a specific category, and there's a need for a check. And this would require more in-depth knowledge of that category. So you may want to actually check the specific methodology being used for a particular category, and this may require that someone understands the emission calculations or understands the process that you is in that category, and so they can do a proper check on that specific category. And so this may be a check that is again not necessarily so it'll be a specific energy check, maybe on calorific values, for example. That's not necessarily something that's required in agriculture, for example. So there are more category-specific checks, as well as the general checks. So these will need to be identified and listed up front as to what kind of activities you're going to include in your QC process. And then we've talked a bit already around the QA procedures. So this is not someone involved, independent reviews, public consultations. So I think we've touched mostly on this, so I don't need to go too much into this. It's just something that should be thought about as people prepare more. I think it becomes more important if you have more inventories over time, then it becomes important to include a QA process. So the QA processes are usually done on a completed inventory, which is different from your quality control. So your quality control is sort of part of the inventory process, whereas the quality assurance usually happens once you've compiled your whole inventory, and then somebody looks at the overall report or the overall inventory and conducts an overall QA process on the whole inventory. And you seek to ensure that the objectives were met, the inventory represents the best possible estimates, giving the current knowledge and of data availabilities, and supports the effectiveness of the QC program as well. So this is really towards the end of your inventory process. I mean, the QA procedures could also highlight issues maybe that could be considered for improvement in the next round that you do an inventory as well. So QA could also lead to identification of your improvements. So once you have sort of thought of all these activities, identified the objectives, your QA procedures, you can create a QA/QC plan, which is basically all the activities that we've just discussed up to this point, but documented in a QA/QC report or document, which you can then attach to your inventory to show that you have a plan and to indicate what procedures were carried out during the QA/QC process. So it should outline the scheduled time of procedures, the key data quality objectives, and also look at ongoing review and maintenance of the QAC plan. So you could have a plan now, but maybe you want to review it and update it with new checks, for example, in the future. So you also need to consider improvements for your plan as well as inventory. This is really if you have started to develop more than one inventory with time. We have also just indicated and that it could be useful to align relevant standards and guidelines such as your ISO standards or other domestic standards such as the South African Statistical Quality Assurance Framework. So aligning it with other standards and guidelines is not mandatory, but it could be useful and enhance your process as well. So if you wanted to include an alignment with those guidelines, then this should also be included as part of your QA/QC plan. So I think that so once you have your plan, and then you can move on to your implementation and your documentation. I think it's important just to mention that, you know, once you have a plan and you know what your activities are and who your roles are, it's important to communicate to the team who's going to be doing what, so everyone knows and knows when they should be checking and what they should be checking for. So that I think communication is quite important when you are looking at a QA/QC. And I think the one thing that is very important is to actually document your activities, because I think I know a good few years ago when we used to do the inventory, and maybe the case now with some of you doing your provincial inventories, that you go, yes, we've checked this, we checked that, but just having someone check but not actually having a document of what was checked, you know, then you don't have the ability to report and say this was our QA/QC activities. So it is good to have some way for you to be able to document what your QA/QC procedures were. So just like Lisa was saying, you know, you have experts maybe check, so they may just check it, but you may not actually document or record that, or have them tick a box or put a number or date or something on it. So it is also, again, something that could be included either in your spreadsheets, or you can also develop just basic templates that when you send it off to someone, you send them a template, just ask them to tick the box, sign their name, and indicate that they did do those checks. So there are a number of different QC templates available. And so if anyone would like to, this is maybe something, as we've mentioned before, that we will be providing. We have time to provide provinces with support for their inventories. And if so you require support with your QA/QC process, we could help you set up templates if you want for the QA/QC process. And here on the slide, I've just indicated, for example, in the national inventory, we just have a page where you can have a check library. It indicates what the check might be, and what the principle it might be aligning with, or what the objectives are. And it's just a page where then if you have a person doing the quality checks, they can just say checked, what date they did it, and if there were any issues, just so that there is now a log of your activities that you can then attach and say, we definitely did it, and these are what was done. So there are different ways that you can keep a log, but I think it is quite important. And then, of course, obviously archiving your whole system, archiving your whole inventory is important, but along with the information on your QA/QC process and your review comments and activities that you did, it's also important to archive all that information along with your inventory. Okay, so I think we've that's just a general sort of overview on the activities. And so maybe we can hear, I think we've talked about the QA process, so maybe we can hear a bit from provinces in terms of, do you conduct QC processes? Do you document them, or is it just a case of somebody looks at it and does a check, but you have no documentation? Or, so I'd like to hear a little bit from the different provinces in terms, particularly more of the quality control. What quality control activities do you do within your province? Anybody?
I'm not seeing any hands so far.
I hope people are doing some. Yes.
It's Lisa.
Lisa?
Honestly, there's no formal written up anything. I think you said, I think in the beginning of the of your presentation about, some people have been working in the space for such a long time that they're so familiar with things. And I think that's kind of where I am. So this is the first, with Jody joining the team in the first a few years ago, the most recent inventory was the first time that I've actually had someone other than myself, another person doing the work. It is interesting that you kind of get so involved with it. But so it was interesting with Jody. I'd asked him to do something while I was on leave over December, because he just started work and he had no leave. And he'd done something and he'd sent it to me. And I could pick up that there was a mistake somewhere. I didn't know exactly where the mistake was, but just by the numbers that had come up, I picked up that he'd made an easy mistake to make. But I knew the numbers well enough that I could pick up that there was a problem somewhere, and then we were able to go back and figure out where that mistake was made. But it's very much like that. It's kind of like looking at things going, okay, that number doesn't look right. Previous years, we got some data for one of the municipalities, and the industrial figure was very, very big. And we were like, this is an area that is mainly rural, mainly agriculture. Why is the industrial figure that big? So it's very much kind of sense check, looking at the data rather than a formal QC process of what we're doing. Yeah.
I mean, I think that is it does show the value of, as you say, of experts. So it is important if you use experts, because often, as you say, they can pick things up very quickly. Just by looking at sort of the relationships of certain activity data or certain emission factors. And so making use of experts, it may not take them very long to pick up basic errors. So I think that it is important, an important way to do and to make use of those people. But yeah, it is. I think what is important is often we talk about just having a second pair of eyes, as you were mentioning, that Jody did it and then you looked at it. Just having a second pair of eyes is also quite, because as I say, when you get involved and you're just doing it, it's very easy to make really silly little mistakes because you're so involved in the process. Matthews, yes.
Yes, it's the same as well. It's not very formal, but now looking at that logbook, when we received the data from DFFE, there's a couple of checks that we did, and there was a couple of discrepancies. But if we had a logbook, when we had a second meeting with DFFE, the articulation of the issues was not very clear, and I realized very late in the meeting that we're not articulating the problems it had with the data very well. The logbook would have given us, even just giving to them the logbook would have given them, oh, okay, this is where the challenges are. And they had answers for some of the questions, but because we didn't have a logbook, yeah, I see now that we actually need a logbook. But yeah, it was very informal. A lot of it was the units. Some of it is industry. Some industries are not in Gauteng, so it's just a matter of maybe it was registered somewhere, and so some of the data are in KZN, for example, or Western Cape, or some of it, all of it is in Gauteng, is registered in Gauteng, so all of the data is in Gauteng. So some of it is just those things. But yeah, I think that logbook will be useful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I do find that having some kind of log of it. And also I'm very conscious of having few people and resources and not overburdening people, because I also, with the national inventory, talk to a lot of international people and they have all these checks and logs and writing. And I'm like, when you've only got one person or 4 people, it becomes a lot of work. So the idea is to try to have some kind of log, but that's sort of quick and easy. So you don't want to make it into necessarily, obviously with time you can make it improve it, but even if you just have a quick check, or even if you have a spreadsheet and you do it in your spreadsheet, you just or in the national inventory, you just have like you just put your initials and the date and a comment right in the cell or right next to the cell, just so that it creates some kind of check, or as I say, or you can have a separate page where it just checks, just so that you have something to say, checks were done. And as you say, Matthew, that could maybe highlight some areas that could be useful if you just had a sort of a list of things. It might also highlight what you need to check in future as well. Jody, yes.
Yes, thank you. Maybe just checking, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Sorry, I have Bluetooth earphones in, so I was just testing. Yeah, so I mean, as Lisa and also Matthews mentioned, it seems to be a very sort of informal sort of the process that happens, but also just touching on our last inventory, it was like sort of the first full inventory that we did for the province, and we were fortunate to have some level of assistance through the climate group. And I think actually in retrospect, we had some assistance with quality control, quality assurance, in the sense that we had some technical, so I'm thinking quality assurance, because we had some technical experts that were able to assist us in reviewing specific sectors. Although it was earlier on in the process and not necessarily at the end, but we were able to sort of get that review process and assistance with the types of data, etc. And then also we were able to participate in a sort of a project where they utilized artificial intelligence and satellite imagery, remote sensing to sort of do a full inventory. So that STARS project that Lisa also mentioned in the last training, the in-person training. And in that way, we were also able to sort of compare and look at what those results were compared to what our results that we got through our processes. So there was a bit of a process of, trying to check and compare and look at the overall quality. So we actually found our data was maybe more trusted due to having actual data that we could
Yeah.
compared to, but again, I think also the other, we mentioned capacity and, one person doing everything, but I think especially with quality assurance, sometimes funding may become a bit of a challenge, because I mean, those processes were great, but we most likely not going to repeat that because of the lack of funding or assistance in that regard. So yeah, that's also just some insights that I found quite interesting.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, thanks for that. I think it is, I mean, it's great if you, as you say, if you do have outside information that you can check and verify your data. But as you say, these are sort of once off kind of thing. I think also, what's really important, is that there can be like many checks that you can do, but I think it's better to have sort of a sensible amount of checks that you can do properly and say that you've done them, rather than having an overwhelming amount and everyone looks at this and goes, oh, this is so much to check. So it's, the idea is to have a look at your resources and what's possible in that time. I actually think probably also a lot of people may do a bit of, as you say, sort of do QC without even really thinking that it's specifically a QC, just having somebody else check this every now and then. So probably provinces do conduct a certain amount of this informally. But just if you have some way just to kind of have a quick document of that, then it does have something that you can then incorporate and say that you have, there have been some quality control processes on the inventory. So yeah, Brett, do you have something to add?
No, I support your last point. I mean, I think that people do it without really thinking about it. Yeah, I see Matthews has got his hand up, but also encourage maybe Mpumalanga if they've got any views, because they've been doing inventories for a while. Might be helpful. But Matthews, go ahead.
It's just as now as Jody was speaking, I realized there's a lot that we do on QC, but we just don't document it. On the land cover data, our information management team have been looking at it for a couple of years. So they've actually found some discrepancies in the national data. So there is a lot that happens. It's just, it's a issue of documenting it and say we've done it. So
Yeah, I think it's really also just when you can say that, as I say, it's more to give people confidence that this is, being checked and the numbers coming out are good. Okay, anyone else with any comments from the province or any other questions? Okay. So I think we're on to your section, Brett.
Yeah, that's great. So do you want to stop sharing?
Yeah, I'll stop sharing.
I can share mine. So, sorry, let me just go to the right slides so I can show you the right thing. Okay, so thanks very much for that, Luann. So I think what we wanted to do there was to give you the kind of the high level overview, and then to go into some of the depth of the discussion. So we recognize that I will be almost repeating some of the material that or some of the thoughts that Luann had as well. But the idea is to really reinforce and to sort of build on what we've heard already. So I'm largely going to be focusing on the QC procedures and going into a bit of a deep dive in them. And I mean, if you want to read more about the majority of what I'm telling you, the IPCC guidelines has a great reference source in that they dedicate one of the chapters to, or they've got a whole document dedicated to QA/QC. So if you know the IPCC guidelines, you can Google them, the 2006 guidelines. It's under volume 1, which is kind of your background information or your general information, and it's chapter 6 of that volume that give you guidance on the types of checks that can be undertaken. And they go through largely the same structure as we've been presenting this training in as well. So it's more data sources, more information, maybe more tips and tricks, if you like, on QA/QC. So, I mean, we've already been hearing this, but we recognize that there are many different kinds of checks that may be performed, and Luann's outlined some of these, and I'm going to be building on that again. And some of these are going to be more simple than others. and won't take you too long to do. And, as I think Lisa and Matthew and others have alluded to, you probably do these as a matter of course while you're busy compiling your inventory. But then there might be others that are more complex. For example, if you go and recalculate emissions from a particular source or a particular category using a completely different methodology, that might be a more time-consuming activity, and so is something you might undertake to do only for certain emission sources. So you need to really give some thought as to in your planning for QC as to how many checks are reasonable to undertake based on the resources and time available. So it's a need to prioritize what QC you're going to be doing. And I think the guidance there, or the rule of thumb, is that it's probably better to do a few checks properly than go and do a lot that are partially completed or that you don't really get a sense at the end of the day whether they've been worthwhile doing. So I mean, we could ask the question here, how would you prioritize QC? Where do you think would be or how would you make a decision about how you focus your QC process? Has anybody got any thoughts on that? What sort of, if you like, rules of thumb would you use to prioritize QC? Okay. I'm not seeing any hands, so maybe I need to give you a little bit more information about what I'm talking about here. Well, there are a few questions which we've identified. Sorry, Martin, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, just a thought, Brett, from my side is that if you check the numbers that comprise 80% of your emissions, so look at the sector that's the largest, prioritize that. Look at the emission sources that are the largest and check those. That's a good way to start, in my opinion.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. Thank you. That's a good starting point, definitely. Any others? Okay, I've got some answers here. So I mean, what Martin's suggested now is really the first bullet point is the category that that you're going through, what's considered a key category. So key category, for those of you that have worked with the emissions guidelines, the 2006 guidelines, refers to either to one of three factors. The first one of these is the magnitude, or as Martin has suggested, does it contribute significantly to the inventory emissions? The second one is, are there some uncertainties around the trend, which Luann has already spoken about a little bit, but are you seeing some significant changes from a previous year, taking into account the consistency discussion that we have had, but are you suddenly seeing a jump of 50 or 100% in a certain emissions category? And the third one is there significant uncertainty associated with the category? So those are the three kind of measures, or the three characteristics of key categories. And if it is a key category, then you might want to prioritize quality control in that category. The second question that you might ask is it very complex, the calculation, or data heavy, that might suggest that there could be mistakes introduced or errors introduced during the calculation? So if, for example, it's diesel consumption multiplied by a diesel factor, and you've got good data around your diesel consumption, then you might not consider it a complex calculation. Whereas if it's something to do with an industrial process, or where you're doing calculations around a generation of waste, and then you'll remember the waste from the GPC training, you'll remember that the waste formulae can be quite data heavy or complex. So that might be one where you would want to prioritize, is just to make sure that you've done all the steps correctly. The next question you might ask is, are we using emission factors that are different from the IPCC defaults? So in some cases, one chooses to use a local emission factor where we don't consider ourselves to be, if you like, representative of the or we consider ourselves to be different from what a global average might be. And so we choose to use our own emissions factor, and then we might want to do some QC around that, sorry. And an example there is coal, fugitive emissions from methane, fugitive emissions of methane from coal mining. And that's one where our emissions are quite substantially different from other countries and from the IPCC default factors. And so there we might choose to just go and check that we are happy with the numbers and do some QC around that. Next question is the data old? Was the category updated a long time ago? And linked to that, I guess, is have there been any changes in data sources or methodologies since the last inventory? So again, this consistency argument. And then the final one is there a risk of double counting? Just making sure that, for example, you haven't included some emissions in both the energy sector and the IPPU sector. And so one might want to do some checks around that. So again, these are the 6 questions, and there might be more that you can think of as to how we prioritize where we focus our QC, given that we don't have endless resources and time to go through a QC process. Okay. And so when we're having a look at this data, there are various things that we might look at. So first of all, our input data. So that refers to the activity data that we used for our calculations. So if you remember back to the GPC training, our activity data might refer to our energy consumption, so our diesel consumption or our petrol consumption. It might refer to the amount of waste generated. It might refer to a certain product produced through a certain process, or in the land use sector, a particular stock of livestock, the number of head of livestock that you might use in your calculation. So that's your input data you might do QC on. You then have a look at your calculations. So that's the conversion of your QC, of your activity data into emissions. So you might check on your emission factor, as we've discussed already, methodology. You might actually look at the calculations that were done. So if you're using a spreadsheet, are your formulae correct? Unit checks are a real biggie because you've got to do all these conversions between tons and kilograms, or terajoules and gigajoules, or kilowatt hours to a gigajoule or something along those lines. And for me, that's one that always trips me up, is you've got to really make sure that you've used the correct unit factors to convert from one to another. Obviously, adding up, you want to make sure that your formulae and if you're using a spreadsheet, actually adds up all the numbers that should be included. And then the final one there, and that goes back to the idea of sort of traceability and being able to check back on your data, is to make sure that your references are provided for all the data inputs. So just to be able to audit your data. So there's a lot that you might want to have a look at, particularly if using spreadsheets. I mean, as Matthews has suggested already, the GPC software that we taught you, the Cirrus software, really helps you to collate all of that data in one place. But it's still data inputs that you're giving it that you might need to check as part of your calculations. And then, of course, we take our information from a calculation and we put it into a report. And there are definitely issues that can arise in taking that data across. And even though, one sometimes finds that the person responsible for transcribing the information from the calculation file into the report might make a mistake on a decimal figure or a comma, or leave off a zero. So you really need to think about whether it's necessary to, as part of your QC process, to check that the numbers are transcribed across. You obviously want to check cross-referencing in your report. That's part of your QC of your inventory, not necessarily of the numbers, but you want to make sure that if your text says in figure 3 this is happening, then you want to make sure that there's cross-referencing there. And then also reports should have all the information in the appendix that supports your inventory calculations, because that is also necessary for transparency. And then finally, we reinforce this point about the archive files to make sure that all the data and documents have been archived and that all the information is reported for future inventories and inventory updates, as has been discussed already. So important to note, just as sort of my take-home message from this file, is that it's not only the numbers and the calculations, but it's also the reporting and archiving that is part of your QC process. All right, so let's dig into this just a little bit more. And I think I've said some of this, but we'll go through it anyway. So obviously there are activities around transcription, really just that you take your data from your reference sources, you cite them properly in your spreadsheets or in your internal documentation and your reports, and you make sure that you've taken data for each category. You do a sampling of data for each category that it's been taken across from a reference source where you're drawing that data out of, put it into your spreadsheets, moved across into your reports appropriately, and then archived appropriately. So that's the idea of transcription errors, is this transition of information, or this moving across of information. You obviously, once again, want to check that your emissions and removals are calculated correctly. And the one way of doing this is to actually go and do the calculation again, go and do the calculation on a piece of paper, and you might also do that, or in a separate spreadsheet. You probably aren't going to do it on paper. Go and do the calculation again manually to make sure that your spreadsheet is set up, or your software is capturing it correctly. And you might also want to do some sort of a simple approximation method that gives similar results to the original. So in other words, use a different approach to make sure that you're kind of on the right track, and that'll pick up things like, unit errors or emission factor errors. So an example there, and I think I come back to it again, is to kind of get an average emissions factor by back calculating from your emissions and your activity data. So if you divide emissions by activity data for a particular category, that'll kind of back calculate an emissions factor, and then you could go and check that's against the one that you have used. So that might be a way to do that kind of double checking, to check that emissions and removals are calculated correctly. So there are various ways that you could do those back of envelope calculations. I mean, I think I mentioned this to you during the CIRIS training. I always check any subnational emissions against the national inventory. So I'll go and have a look at and I don't have my numbers at my fingertips, but if the national inventory is around 500 megatons, and we expect that the electricity sector is what, 80% of that. If I go and have a look at my province's inventory and they're taking up that same amount of space, then I know there's an error. Or if it's not aligning with my 500 megatons odd, if it's 1,000 megatons from a particular source in a certain province, then I know that number is wrong. So that's my kind of cross-check, my simple approximation method. Or I think Luann alluded to this as well. I might go and have a look at what another province has calculated and scale it up or down to my province, and then make an assessment of whether that's a rough calculation, and that will help pick up some of the errors that come across during calculation. Consistency between data between categories. This is making sure that you're using the same data between multiple categories. And I've done reviews of inventories in various places, not necessarily here in South Africa, but where I found that they'll use a different exchange rate in every one of their spreadsheets. So you might have a rand-dollar exchange rate, for example, if one's using that for calculation of consumption, and it will be different in different spreadsheets. Or I'll find constants or emission factors for the same fuel that are different in different spreadsheets or in different places. So one really has to make sure that all of your activity data, as well as your constants, are consistent between the different data and category sources, because that can obviously add in errors, and it's just poor practice. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier, is if you are using spreadsheets for calculation of your inventories, which you may not be doing, of course, you may be using the software, is to maybe put all of the emission factors in one sheet, or all of the global warming potentials in one sheet. And in that way, you only have to check it once in terms of your QC procedures, but also if you need to change that number, so for example, the update from AR2 to AR5, you only need to do it in one place, and then that will help you to avoid the errors in your spreadsheets, and then it does also make QC a lot easier. And then the point that we review the internal documentation, and I've mentioned this already, the importance of archiving and storage of your data and your records in one place, and that are properly documented. The internal documentation is critical to be able to come back and either support a QA process down the line, if that's something that is feasible. We're obviously hearing that there aren't the resources available, but you might wish to do QA or further QC down the line, and that you're able to enable reproduction of the emissions and removal and uncertainty estimates, as well as to, if you need to go back and update time series data in future, then you need to have the properly documented information. And that's part of this QC activity. Okay, moving on. Trend checks, we've already mentioned a couple of times, are a very useful way of doing QC, because obviously if you're getting 100, 105, 110, and then it goes up to 10,000, then you obviously know that there's some issue in your current year inventory. And another way of doing trend checks is the calculation of these implied emission factors, which I mentioned already, where you use the aggregate emissions in a particular category divided by the activity data, and you do this for each time slot in the time series, and then you make sure that you kind of are coming to a similar number. And in this way, you'll kind of be sure that you haven't made mistakes in this year or in a previous year. So trend checks give you a very quick visual idea of whether there are any issues in your data. And then a final point around this is to check for completeness. So you really want to confirm that you report all categories for all years, that you've got a data from the base year to the current inventory. So you try and make sure that you've got, again, this consistent information covered for all the categories that you're able to, and try and make sure that that category is complete. So you may try and make sure that all of your subcategories are covered in terms of emission sources as part of your QC process. So yeah, so those are just some of the kind of areas, just to flip through some of the areas where you might want to have a look at your QC process. So transcription, calculation, consistency, documentation and archiving, looking at trends, and looking for completeness in your inventory. And they're all part of this QC process. There are some tips and tricks that we can sort of also highlight here. I mean, automated checks are obviously your kind of Rolls Royce of your calculation software. So, for example, if you've got somebody with the spreadsheeting skills, if you are using a spreadsheet to do kind of range checks, so you can make sure that you write, macro or some sort of formatting. I'm going to get to formatting in a moment, to make sure that nothing is outstanding. So it can basically look at the data, if you know how to automate it, and say, oh, this number doesn't seem to be within range. Kind of along the lines of my example of my always looking back at the national inventory, and it kind of says if this is more than 10% of that number, then it gives you a flag of that data and helps you to identify outliers of the data automatically. But of course, this isn't always possible, and it does depend on how your calculations are set up as to whether you can do automated checks of your data. And then another point, sort of not really related to the automated checks, is just where you are not doing all of the calculations in-house. So, for example, if you've outsourced, I remember Western Cape mentioned that they'd got a consultant to do their land use, I think it was land use or forestry inventory, just to make them also aware that of your QA/QC plan and procedures, and that they are required to actually do the QC procedures and document these QC procedures. So these are two unrelated points, but just to remind anybody who's doing the calculations for you to actually do the QC. Okay, so those are generic sort of things to think about. I've got a couple of things here that I just want to mention around specifically spreadsheets, and some tips for setting up spreadsheets if that's what you're going to be using. I've mentioned some of these already, but I mean, I think the first thing is don't hard code equations or hard code numbers, but rather link cells. So as far as possible, just try and make your spreadsheet auditable. This comes down to auditability, that people are able to calculate how you got to a particular number. So they can go and see, okay, you multiplied that by that, and that's how you got to this number, rather than either just putting the number straight in or putting in sort of hard to access calculations. Try and think logically about what a person that's interested in this calculation is going to be looking for. I've already mentioned to you the point about putting commonly used factors like emissions factors, global warming potentials, conversion factors between your units. So remember my megawatt hours, terajoules example. Put them in their own cells or even on their own sheets and link to them. So in this way, if they change, then it's easy to implement the change. But it also means that you can go you can go and check that you've used the right conversion factor. So it comes back to the first point of if you're converting something from terajoules to megawatt hours to terajoule, you don't do it within the equation, but you use the conversion factor from another cell to actually do that calculation. So keep that in its own cells, keep it in its own sheet if it's being used across multiple sheets, and it really makes the auditability much easier to do. And then the third point comes back to this thing of automatic checks. So I mentioned to you the one way is you can do macros to look at ranges, but the other tool that you can use is what's called conditional formatting. So just to plant that word in your brain, but conditional formatting allows you to will automatically shade a cell in a particular color, for example, if it lies within a range, and it will shade it in another color if it lies without the range. So you can apply a conditional formatting to a set of cells, and it will give you a visual picture of where there might be an outlier, for example. You can easily Google how to do conditional formatting. It does vary a little bit between software, so I'm not going to show you how to do that between the version of Microsoft you've got, but it's a great tool to help with identification of errors. And you will also want to format differently, for example, your national total or your provincial total and your sector total. You want to use some sort of formatting there. And I mean, it goes maybe further than conditional formatting, is as shown in the picture on the right-hand side, is to format different kinds of information in different colors. And I've always found this hugely useful, is to, the constants in that picture, I know it's very small, are all in blue. The calculated cells are in yellow. I think it's even smaller on my screen. And then your absolute absolute numbers might be or your activity numbers might be in another color, your data sources in blue, your comments or your verification details in green. So by formalizing or standardizing a color scheme, it really helps to make auditability of spreadsheets very easy if you're going to be using these. I think one of the worst things, one of the big challenges with spreadsheets is that people set them up very quickly, don't think too much about the auditability and the fact that in 6 months' time they're going to come back to them and not remember how to use that spreadsheet. Or in a year, when you're trying to redo your spreadsheet, you've forgotten what's calculated, what's input data, what's reference data. So by setting up a system early and using that system, getting accustomed to that system, you can save yourself tons and tons of time down the line on your spreadsheeting. That's not only for inventories, but for all spreadsheeting. So I think that for me is quite a big take-home message: is format early, make it clear, you get a system, and it will help a lot. So that was all general, the kind of general QC procedures. And as Luann mentioned, those kinds of QC procedures can often be done by somebody who's not a sector specialist or not an inventory specialist necessarily. They can check that stuff's been carried across and that your spreadsheets are set up right and your calculations are right. But what you might also want to do as part of your QC process is to do category-specific QC. So this is an additional layer or a supporting layer to the general QC procedures. And here you will focus obviously on the specific types of data used for individual source or sink categories. So obviously what you're going to do here is depends on it's going to be done on a case-by-case basis, and the depth you go into it will differ depending on the category that you're looking at. And here, of course, in the same way as your general QC, it will focus on both emissions and removals and the activity data. So here you'll go and explore in a little bit more depth about things like the emission factors, for example. So, we often default to the IPCC emission factors, or typically our starting point is the IPCC emission factors. But then we can ask ourselves the question as part of the QC process, are these applicable to the national circumstances? And I mentioned this to you already, the methane, fugitive methane from coal mines, for example. So are they relevant in South Africa? No, they might not be. So then we might want to use a more relevant local emission factor. So here we might want to default at the provincial level to the national emission factors, and we do have a comprehensive emission factor guide, which we showed you during the training, and we can show you again, which shows you where we've deviated as a country from the national emission factors. I'd imagine the province, this would be your most likely source of emission factors, that you wouldn't develop your own provincial emission factors, but they might be, I can't think of any circumstances where you would, but maybe people can chip in if I've missed any thoughts on this. And if you wanted to, under your category specific QC, you could dive into the models that we used for calculating the country specific or the province specific emission factors, do some comparisons with the IPCC defaults, just to make sure that they use similar units. Are these similar to maybe other countries in Africa or regions in Africa? So this is really getting down into the heart of QC, might be something that you would consider down the line with your inventory. Lisa.
Yeah, we've had some interesting conversations with other groupings in the province about the emission factors. Because Western Cape has made some commitments about being the lowest carbon province in the country and things like that. There were groupings that felt that we should have a different emissions factor based only on based mainly on the electricity that is generated within the boundaries of the Western Cape. So that would be Coburg, that would be all the renewable plants, and then whatever's left would be taken from the national mix. And there was this long conversation about discussions about this, saying that that would be sort of a more true reflection of the emissions in the Western Cape, because that's what's generated in the Western Cape. And there were quite a few arguments about that. Because, you know, South Africa is based on the national grid, and we have that, you know, the national grid process, and we can't just kind of pick and choose what emissions we want to allocate, or what generation types we want to allocate to our emissions factor in the Western Cape. So we finally got to the point where we actually agreed that we cannot, you know, try and skew the system by just choosing the low carbon options for our emissions factor. But there was a lot of pressure at one point for us to actually go that route with a provincial specific emissions factor. But I was never comfortable with that approach. It just didn't sit right with that. So yeah, I just thought I'd share that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's a great debate, and one that I think is being held at all levels of inventories, and, you know, in the private sector as well, as how do you calculate your emissions. And I think what we actually said during the GPC, the GPC actually aligns, I guess, with what your final decision was, and suggests that one should use a location-based emission factor rather than what you're effectively talking to, I think, is a market-based emission factor, where you know, it's about, I mean, almost a market-based emission factor where you buy your electricity from, you know. And the GPC does say you've got to have a look at the mix of the grid, which you're using, and we can't separate out Coburg and I don't know, the wind farms from the rest of the grid that's being consumed. So yeah, it's an interesting debate. I have read some stuff that people are starting to move beyond that, but it's an evolving field. Thanks for sharing that. Appreciate it. Luann, do you have anything that you want to add on that?
Oh, sorry, just getting my mic. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and well, I mean, I always find it interesting talking about the different sectors, because I think, in terms of, for example, agriculture, that there may be possibilities to use more specific factors for livestock, because, for example, in provinces, you know, the emission factors for livestock are based really on the circumstances and the management and the manure management situations within a province. And in those cases, provinces probably hold a lot more detailed data than we can be obtained at a national level. And so it may be a case where for agriculture, it may be more suitable to have more specific province-specific emission factors for, you know, in the agriculture sense. I think then it would be useful, you know, to have those emission factors feed up to national level, because, yeah, I mean, I think it's just based on how much data is available at a provincial level or at a national level. So I think there are possibly some cases or instances where having provincial level emission factors may be useful. Yeah.
Thanks, Luann. Yeah, I'm not seeing any other hands. Okay, great. So thank you both for those inputs. Then obviously, you know, when you're looking at the category specific QC, you're going to have a look at your activity data, and I think we've kind of covered most of this. We have a look at different reference sources for activity data, compare with independent data sets if these are available. So if you can cross compare, I don't know, if you haven't used a national energy balance, you might want to use the national energy balance to cross compare, or if you've got you know, provincial data and you want to compare it with maybe an industry board's data, that would be an ideal way of comparing activity data. So depending on which category you're looking at, I've mentioned trend checks already. We can do these not only on emissions, but also on activity data. Yeah. And then obviously, again, the methodologies and calculations. So we can really go through the whole process of calculation for individual categories. So, excuse me. So really, just to summarize before we enter into discussion, So the QA/QC process is really there to ensure that the inventory is credible and that the quality is high. Luann has outlined for you the TACCC principles, which provide us with the indicators of quality of our inventory. And we mustn't see this as a separate process to the inventory process. It's quite critical to actually see it as an integral part of the inventory process that isn't tacked on at the end. And so this requires planning up front when you're planning for your inventory, and actually management of this QA/QC process in parallel with the actual inventory process itself. But we also recognize, of course, that there is resource availability constraints, which have been mentioned throughout this session, and data availability, which has come up at every one of our trainings so far. So we recognize that there is a bit of a trade-off between doing a really comprehensive QA/QC process, but also the real constraints. But having said that, there is also the consideration that the QA/QC plan helps us to revise our inventory and to improve the quality of the inventory process. So there's definitely benefit in it, in addition to the credibility and quality of the inventory, to actually help with providing us with that reflection space in order to help improve our inventory process. So yeah, so I think that brings us to the end of our material. We actually have a much shorter training session than we expected today. But our hope now is just to enter discussion, questions, identification of where support might be valuable to you through your inventory process. So the floor is open. Maybe before I dive in, Luann, if there's anything else you want to add, but otherwise we'll open the floor to anybody who wants to contribute. And Luann's posted the survey form just to request that you complete that, please.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. No, I think just say we've covered quite a bit of discussion and information about QA/QC process. And so we would like to hear from provinces how they're doing, and really, if you need any support, that's what we are here for. So if anyone has any questions, or maybe you think that would be nice to set that up in our system or to create templates, yeah, maybe you can just highlight from your provinces what your needs might be in terms of QA/QC. So it'd be good to hear from everybody regarding that.
Matthews, please go ahead.
Yes, no, well, Gauteng will definitely take up the offer for assistance. We just haven't set up a date as yet. And it sounds like it will be in the QC/QA arena, because it sounds like that's the most important part. And I think as well, it might be in the formalizing of the QA/QC, because that would make sense to have some procedures and templates so that somebody else can actually have a look and actually replicate easily. So we'll definitely take it. Thanks.
Great,
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah, that'll be great. I mean, I think with it's difficult for us to give a blanket sort of template. That's why we ask from provinces, because each of you will no doubt be using different systems or different tools, and so it's easier to sort of tailor them according to whatever systems you have in place. So yeah, so it'd be good to see what you have, and then we can develop appropriate templates for that system.
Yeah. Dudu, can I maybe put you on the spot and see if you can share some experiences from Mpumalanga on QA/QC? It's nice to see you on the call. Okay, I don't know if it is able to talk. If there's anybody from the other provinces who's got some thoughts on on either experiences or on needs, on support needs. Hi there, Dudu. I see your mic's on. Hi.
Hi, colleagues, and hi, Brett. I think as Mpumalanga, since we have developed the GSG inventory, we noted that there was a lot of quality assurance and quality control that we have never looked at, basically. So I fully agree with the colleagues that maybe that has another area where we really, as Mpumalanga, need a lot of assistance. And I think we still haven't responded to the email that was sent by Lewan to look at what other sectors that would really need to have more engagement with you and then to unpack it a little bit. So we are looking forward for that. And as Mpumalanga, we really want to strengthen the greenhouse gas inventory that we have developed to be more effective and to respond to the situation that is happening on the ground. Currently, the one that we have developed, there are a lot of loopholes that we still have to tidy up, especially on the private sector information that IPCC that has indicated to say we have to be in detail with it. I think that is what I could indicate at the moment. I thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much for that input today, and certainly we are around to support. Luann, please go ahead. I see your hands up.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I know quality control, sometimes we're talking about those that already have systems, but I think as Brett mentioned in his presentation, even if you're a province that hasn't got your inventory or you're starting out to develop your inventory, now may also be a very good time to consider these activities and incorporate them as you start to develop. So there's no harm in developing it right. In fact, it's really good to develop it right from the beginning. So, if you are those provinces that are right at the beginning and are just starting up your first inventory, these are also aspects that you can consider at this early stage. Thanks.
Thanks, Luann. Kumodzo, please go ahead. I saw your hand disappear.
Thanks. In Limpopo, we have the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, but we never really paid attention to quality control and quality assurance. And it's a lesson that we need to take forward because often these inventories are developed by service providers and we do not get to understand or scrutinize the issues around quality assurance and control. So it's something that we need to look into.
Thank you. So, Luann, I see your hand still up. I'm not sure if there was something else you wanted to add.
Yeah, no, I have another point to add. I was also thinking in terms, of quite a few of these checks, and since looking at some of the responses we've had through other sessions and through emails, that there's also close coordination or links with the air quality groups in the provinces. And so, it may, in terms of resources, it could also be considered that some of the people from the air quality could also conduct some of the basic checks required for the inventory. So that may just be another resource to think about, is just, as I say, always to get a second pair of eyes. And so it may be someone from air quality, even though it may be slightly different, they could still have some experience or even do some of the general checks that need to be done on the inventory as well.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more hands. Okay, so this morning's session was, oh wait, sorry, Dudu, please go ahead.
I think what Luann is saying, it will be great for us. What we've noticed that they were supposed to do the emission inventory on the equality side. So if we all just balance it together, it will benefit on their side. And at the same time, if let's take for instance, we don't have a personnel that is going to assist us on the inventory, on the greenhouse gas emission, that person can be linking both the emissions and together with the greenhouse gas emission. So I fully support that idea.
Great.
That's great. That's great. Thanks, Tulu. So yeah, so I think this morning's was going to be a shorter session. I know we blocked till 12 o'clock out of your diaries, but I'm sure everybody's happy to have a little bit of extra time in their days. So thank you all once again for the really great attendance. We appreciate how enthusiastically the provinces are taking up this opportunity and look forward to the engagements with you on all of the topics we've covered already. And then, Luann, correct me if I'm wrong, but the next training is in June, which is around target setting. Am I right about that?
I think we have some training. Yeah, I should have looked at the schedule.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, it's fine. I think we might have some training in May on around the non-state actor tool from
Yes.
ICAT, but I think that's really going to be around tracking. And so maybe what we'll do is we'll send to everybody just updated schedule. So I don't think it hasn't changed. The dates were still as they were. So I don't know if Martin, if you've got the dates at hand, probably not. But if not, we'll send an update to everybody just to let everybody know when the next one is. But I think that will be on the tracking, and then in June we have the training on the target setting. Yeah.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. So yeah, but please keep engaging with us, send us emails, send us support requests, and let's keep the conversation going while we, in the time between now and the next session. So that's it from me. I don't know if Luann or Martin needs to say anything else.
No, I think that's all from my side, except if you can fill in the survey, I would appreciate it.
Thanks.
Luann, does the survey cover feedback on the training, or is it just attendance?
No, there was a registration form, and now I've put a survey so that everyone can indicate, how the training went. And so that will cover both the training for the QA/QC and the institutional arrangements that we did 2 weeks ago. So if you could just let us know, because this will just help us improve training as we go forward.
Yeah. Great. Well, if there's nothing else from anybody else, well, then thank you and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.